Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So I've just finished and uploaded the video about Dave Futrell talking about MRAs and MGTOW and the alt-right and white supremacy as he does. And I still have to get back to 4 MRA arguments that actually have a point and where they go wrong. But before going back to that article, I wanted to do a video about a Huffington Post article which I saw. Now the Huffington Post article, I'm guessing a lot of you have seen it by now, was called "Could It Be Time to Deny White Men the Franchise?" Now since I originally read this and went off and did other things, there's been some updates. So first of all, Huffington Post took it down. As we see here in their article, "White Men and the Vote, Why We Took the Blog Down." And it's got Huffington Post, South Africa has removed the blog, "Could It Be Time to Deny White Men the Franchise?" And it goes on to say there was a bit of an outcry, and they did research into the blogger, the person who wrote the article, and they couldn't determine whether the person was legit or not, whether they were a real person or someone trying to con Huffington Post. I think they probably should have done that before they published the article, and I assume someone at Huffington Post actually read it and still okayed it, even though it was talking about denying white men the right to vote, and it still got the stamp of approval by someone, unless Huffington Post just publishes anything without even reading it, which would be, just as bad, right? Actually, I'm not sure which one of those two possibilities is worse. The fact that someone read this article and agreed to publish it, or whether they just don't read articles and publish them anyway. I'm really not sure which of those two possibilities is more embarrassing for Huffington Post, because they're both pretty bad. They're both really, really fucking bad. But then there was an update after that. After they took it down, there was yet another update. And the update is revealed. Here is Shelley Garland and why he did it. Yes, it turns out that Shelley Garland, the author of the article, is actually a man, and he wrote the article to show that journalism is presently a piece of shit, and that anything will be published without proper fact-checking. Here's a couple of paragraphs from that article.
Garland was the pseudonym Root used to deceive Huffington Post South Africa last week when it published his blog under the headline "Could It Be Time to Deny White Men the Franchise?" The blog led to a public outcry, after which it was taken down. HuffPost SA published the blog without verifying the author's identity or the veracity of the claims made in the piece. "I just thought you can say almost anything you want. Not necessarily attacking white men. I think there is a lack of fact-checking in South African journalism. I thought, would it work? And it worked. In hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. I didn't think it would get this big," Root said. The short, stocky man, wearing a charcoal jersey with sleeves pulled up to his elbows, appeared nervous, reserved and resigned to the fact that he had been identified. He apologized for the impact on Pillay 3 times in the first 5 minutes of a 26-minute interview. Root explained he didn't target HuffPost specifically and that his main motivation was the lack of fact-checking in journalism. He also identified a few stories published by South African media which he believes are inaccurate and which served as his motivation. Some of these stories were linked in the Garland blog. Root says he believes the resultant furor might lead to a debate in society about race relations and journalistic ethics. This, he added, was a good thing. Twitter mobs amplify anger to where it doesn't need to be, and I think that's a problem. Maybe I did raise some good points about journalism in South Africa. I've seen some journalists saying it should never have been published because it was a silly piece, and it was a silly piece. He repeatedly emphasized that his mission was to see what was the most outrageous piece he could get published, and his next effort was to have been a blog titled "Why the Khmer Rouge Weren't All That Bad." He punted the piece to the Huffington Post, but it did not get through our systems. The Khmer Rouge is the logical destination of Marxist thought. In Cambodia there was no classes, everyone was equal, you couldn't even own a vegetable garden and could be shot for picking up fruit that fell from a tree. I want to see what is the silliest thing I can get published.
So I have to say good on him. The fact that he got this published is really fucking embarrassing for Huffington Post. The fact that they read this, like I said, someone actually read this and thought, yeah, that's fine, we'll publish that. We won't check to see if any of it's correct. We'll ignore the fact that it is racist against whites and sexist against males. We'll just ignore all that and we'll publish it anyway, right? Present day journalism is shit, basically. It really is. And Huffington Post really, really should be embarrassed over this. So now that we know the article was written by a Poe trying to expose how shoddy modern day journalism is, let's have a look at the actual article. Now remember, folks, this isn't a legit article. Shelley Garland doesn't actually exist. It's actually a man pretending to be a woman who wrote this. But like I said, the fact that Huffington Post published it, yeah, it really shows a lack of care about what they publish. So as I said, the article is called, "Could it be time to deny white men the franchise? This redistribution of the world's wealth is long overdue, and it's not just South Africa where white males own a disproportionate amount of wealth." Now, when I originally read this and decided to do a video about it, I was going to point out that the argument is faulty. I mean, in South Africa, whites are the minority, and she makes a point in the article, as you'll see, that even though whites in South Africa are the minority, they own the majority of the wealth. And she says this is exactly the same case in the rest of the world, which is demonstrably not true. Sure, whites own the majority of wealth in Western worlds, and that's because they're the majority of the population. And if you look at countries which aren't majority white, then in most cases they don't own the majority of the wealth. It's not true in Japan or China or Chad or numerous other countries. Now, this was obvious to me. Apparently, it wasn't obvious to someone at Huffington Post who went ahead and published this. They didn't question it. They just thought it was fine. And like I said, someone must have read this. Someone must have gone through it. Surely they just don't publish anything without reading it. So let's have a look at the first couple of paragraphs of the article.
Some of the biggest blows to the progressive cause in the past year have often been due to the votes of white men. If white men were not allowed to vote, it is unlikely that the United Kingdom would be leaving the European Union, it is unlikely that Donald Trump would now be the President of the United States, and it is unlikely that the Democratic Alliance would now be governing 4 of South Africa's biggest cities.
Now remember, this is a fake article written by someone to expose how shoddy journalism is, but, I mean, that first paragraph is exactly the type of shit we hear by legitimate people all the time. You know, if whites didn't vote, Trump wouldn't have been elected to office. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake there. If white men didn't vote for Trump, he wouldn't make it into office. We hear this shit all the time. And you know what? The majority of voters for Trump would have been white, once again, because the majority of the population is white, just like the majority of voters for Obama would have been white. They seem to forget that part, conveniently. So let's have a look at the next paragraph.
If white men no longer had the vote, the progressive cause would be strengthened. It would not be necessary to deny white men indefinitely. The denial of the vote to white men for 20 years, just less than a generation, would go some way to seeing a decline in the influence of reactionary and neoliberal ideology in the world. The influence of reckless white males were one of the primary reasons that led to the Great Recession, which began in 2008. This would also strike a blow against toxic white masculinity, one that is long needed.
Once again, this isn't that far off what we hear on a fairly regular basis in the mainstream media, and most definitely from the lunatics on Tumblr, and often from Black Lives Matter, and a lot of gender studies students, and even some professors come out with this type of stuff. Hashtag not all, but a fucking lot of them. And I'm sure there are many people out there who thought this was a good idea. Yeah, let's deny white men the vote, because that would fix everything. And we often hear this thing, if there were less white men in charge, then the world would be a fucking paradise. Bullshit. There would still be corrupt people, there would still be incompetent people, there would still be greedy people, all making bad choices. There would still be conflict, too. Now, I'm not suggesting those who aren't white men make worse choices. I'm simply saying that white men and those who aren't white men, be they black women or white women or black men or whatever, they're just as human as the white men. They're just as capable of being corrupt or incompetent or greedy or good for that matter. But imagine if we did take the vote away from white men for 20 years, as is suggested here. Now, the claim is that after 20 years, white men would get the vote back. Now, do you think that would actually happen? I would see two scenarios, right? The first one is that nothing really changes. The world is still full of bad people doing bad things, and conflict and war and greed and all the other shit that goes along with it. And as a result of that, the excuse could be made that, well, we thought 20 years would be long enough, but it seems that it's not. Maybe let's have another 20, maybe 40 years, because we just need a bit longer for things to change, right? That's the first scenario. The second scenario is that things actually do change, for whatever reason. In which case they would say, well, we can't give white men back the vote, because if we do, things will go back to the way they were, and we have to make sure that doesn't happen. When you take away rights from any group, it doesn't matter if they're white, black, male, female, or whatever, and you use these types of excuses, it can be very difficult to get those rights back. And that's one of the main problems I have with people who argue this type of bullshit. The other one being, of course, that even if you believe that a select number of white males are responsible for all the economic hardship in the world, that doesn't mean that every white male is responsible, or that the only people responsible are white males. Anyway, let's go on to the next paragraph.
At the same time, a denial of the franchise to white men could see a redistribution of global assets to their rightful owners. After all, white men have used the imposition of Western legal systems around the world to reinforce modern capitalism. A period of 20 years without white men in the world's parliaments and voting booths will allow legislation to be passed which could see the world's wealth far more equitably shared. The violence of white male wealth and income inequality will be a thing of the past.
There, once again, I have to give credit to the author here of really capturing the feel of this type of person, and I assume we've all seen this type of thing before. If only it wasn't for the white men, or men in general, the world would be a paradise, right? And this comes from intersectionality and what I like to call the alpha oppressor. You see, the idea behind intersectionality is that straight people oppress gay people, and white people oppress non-white people, and males oppress females. So when you have someone who is a straight white male, they are a triple oppressor. They are the alpha oppressor, and therefore must be responsible for all the evil in the world. They are essentially the Satan of intersectionality, and therefore it's perfectly all right to demonize, criticize, and take away their rights. Okay, let's go on to the next paragraph.
This redistribution of the world's wealth is long overdue, and it is not just South Africa where white males own a disproportionate amount of wealth. While in South Africa 90% of the country's land is in the hands of whites, it is safe to assume these are mainly men.
Now, I like the bit here where he says, it's safe to assume these are mainly men. Once again, how did Huffington Post let this get through, right? Surely alarm bells should have been sounding at something like that. I mean, even if we were to take these statistics at face value, these men would be married, right? So they're not the only ones who own the wealth. It is safe to assume that these are mainly men should have been a fucking warning sign to someone at Huffington Post. But anyway, let's continue.
Along with 97% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
Yes, so that bit there about the stock exchange is actually not true. So the actual figures apparently, and this is from the later article where it's revealed to be a fake article. The actual statistics are that whites own 22% and blacks own 23%. But no one bothered to check this. No one bothered to check to see if the 97% claim was in fact true. I mean, why would you if you're a journalist, right? Because the article's written by a woman from South Africa, so therefore, I mean, it must be true. There couldn't be anything wrong about it, could there? Fucking lazy, HuffPoe. Really fucking lazy. Let's continue.
This is also the norm in the rest of the world.
This is also the norm in the rest of the world. Really, HuffPoe, you didn't think that was bullshit. You think 97% of all the stock exchanges around the world are owned by white men? Really? No one at Huffington Post thought this was bullshit. No one had alarm bells going off when they read that. It's just fucking astounding, really. Let's continue.
Namibia has similar statistics with regard to land distribution, and one can assume this holds for other assets too. As Oxfam notes, 8 men control as much as wealth as the poorest 50% of the world's population. In the United States, 10% of the population, nearly all white, own 90% of all assets. It is likely that these assets are largely in the hands of males.
Yeah, let's have a look at that last stat, because that's quite interesting. The actual statistics, if you follow the link, says the top 10% of white families own almost everything. So families include both males and females. So we're not just talking about white men here. Once again, someone at HuffPoe should have picked up on this. And the same citation says this.
Just as wealth is heavily concentrated nationally, it is also heavily concentrated within racial groups, especially among whites. The bottom 32.1% of white families have an average net worth of $0.
So it clearly states that there are poor families as well, poor white families as well. And using the argument that because there are a very small number of rich white men, it's okay to discriminate against all white men is a bullshit argument. And once again I have to say, why didn't someone at Huffington Post stop this from being published? Why didn't they question it? It really goes to show the present state of journalism. It's just shit.
Although statistics by race are difficult to find from other parts of the world, it is very likely that the majority of the world's assets are in the hands of white males, despite them making up less than 10% of the world's population.
So here the author says, it's hard to come across the stats, but we should just assume that white males own everything. It's just a safe assumption. You know, we don't need to back it up with anything. And HuffPoe thought this was okay. Oh, fuck. Let's continue.
It is obvious that this violent status quo will not change without a struggle, and the only way to do so will be through the expropriation of these various assets and equitably distribute them to those who need them. This will not only make the world a more equitable place, but will also go some way to paying the debt that white males owe the world. Over the past 500 years, colonialism, slavery, and various aggressive wars and genocides have been due to the actions of white men. redistributing some of their assets will go some way to paying the historical debt that they owe society.
Once again, no one at Huffington Post questioned this. Now, let's have a look at some of the stats of modern-day slavery around the world. So 58% of the slaves in the world today are in 5 countries. Those countries are India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Uzbekistan. Now, the countries with the lowest slavery today are Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Belgium, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Can you think what all those countries have in common? They're all Western countries. And that's because slavery has been a dirty word in the West for a long time. So yeah, sure, it is true that the West and whites do have a history of slavery, as do every other race and nation in the history of mankind. It's not just white people who have been doing it. But you can't hold present-day whites responsible for what their ancestors may have done, and in most cases didn't do. I mean, in America, for example, the slaves were owned by a minority who were rich enough to actually own slaves. So the vast majority of present-day white Americans, their ancestors never owned slaves. And even if they did, it still doesn't make them responsible. But you could have a scenario where someone has an ancestor who, for example, might have been Irish, right? And they fled Ireland because of the potato famine and went to America for a new life. And arriving in New York, they volunteer to join the army to fight against the South. Or maybe they're forced into it by whatever means. So here we have someone who is new to America, who has never owned slaves, who is not responsible for slavery, and is actively fighting against it. And we're told that their descendant is somehow responsible for slavery because of the colour of their skin. I mean, it's just a fucking ludicrous argument, yet it is one we commonly hear. And it seems it's one which is perfectly okay with Huffington Post because they fucking published it. Let's go on. We've still got a little bit of the article to get through.
It is no surprise that liberalism, and its ideological offshoots of conservatism and libertarianism, are the most popular ideologies among white males. These ideologies, with their focus on individuals and individual responsibility, rather than group affiliation, allow white men to ignore the debt that they owe society, and from acknowledging that most of their assets, wealth, and privilege are the result of theft and violence. Some may argue that this is unfair. Let's be clear, it may be unfair, but a moratorium on the franchise for white males for a period of between 20 and 30 years is a small price to pay for the pain inflicted by white males on others, particularly those with black, female-identifying bodies. In addition, white men should not be stripped of their other rights, and this withholding of the franchise should only be a temporary measure, as the world rights the wrongs of the past. A withholding of the franchise from white males, along with the passing of legislation in this period to redistribute some of their assets, will also, to a degree, act as the reparations for slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, which the world is crying out for to be paid.
Okay, so when I first read this, I thought the apartheid argument was very interesting. I can kind of understand it from someone coming from South Africa, but obviously the rest of the world isn't responsible for apartheid. In fact, the rest of the world was against it, including many white men publicly arguing against it, fighting against it, including those evil white male politicians and the white males who voted for them. We're all against apartheid, right? I mean, that's one of the main reasons why it ended, yet no one at Huffington Post seemed to pick this up. Just fucking amazing. Let's go on. There's still a little bit to go.
As we saw after the recent altercation between a white man and Lebohang Mabini at a Spur restaurant in Johannesburg, white males still believe that they are in control, and people who are white or male, and particularly black female-identifying people, have to bow to their every whim. There are numerous other examples of white angry male violence in South Africa and abroad, often against black bodies. Dylan Ruth's terrorist actions in the United States is only one of many examples. It is time to wrestle control of the world back from white males, and the first step will be a temporary restriction of the franchise to them. Although this may seem unfair and unjust, allowing white males to continue to call the shots politically and economically, following their actions over the past 500 years, is the greater injustice.
Yeah, so I've got to say, it is an exceptionally well-written Poe article, and really no different than a lot of articles I've read in the past. You get the same arguments a lot these days, unfortunately. So I'm not overly surprised that HuffPoe gave it the seal of approval without so much as a question, and actually published this. I mean, of course, if it wasn't against white males, then I'm sure someone would have picked up on it and stopped it, right? But the fact that it's against white males, well, who cares, right? Because, like I said, white males are the alpha oppressor. They're the Satan of intersectionality. So it's perfectly fine to shit all over them and discriminate against them and talk about taking away their money and their rights. Now, for the record, I think that the rich should be fairly taxed, and the fact that they often have loopholes and avoid paying a lot of what they should is bullshit. So, yeah, by all means, tax those who are rich. And I've got no issue with that tax money going towards programs for the poor. I think having a social safety net for the poor isn't a bad thing. A fair social safety net. And I think one of the best things you can do to get people out of poverty is education. That's where a lot of resources should be focused. So in poor neighbourhoods which have very poor education, there should be a lot done to help those schools, to get them up to a proper standard. If we equalise education, then it allows people a greater hope of escaping poverty. It gives them a greater means. Now, that's not the only thing, obviously, but I think it does go a long way. And sure, at this point, there are probably some people typing, criticising the present state of education, and I probably agree with a lot of what you've got to say. But I still think good education is a good means to combat poverty. And I think people who are poor should also have good health cover. There are a lot of things we can do to help poor people. Taking away the votes of white males is not one of them. Apparently, someone at Huffington Post disagrees. Otherwise, this never would have been published in the first place. And I thought I was done, but I've got yet another update. I'd finished all the audio and I was halfway through the animation and the overlays when I came across this article by Andrew Bolt. Now, in case you don't know who Andrew Bolt is, he's a rather right-leaning journalist from Australia. He's a little bit too right-wing for my tastes, so I tend to not have a great love for him and disagree with him on a lot of things. But that doesn't mean that he gets everything wrong. He's actually been right about a few things in the past, well, probably more than a few things. And he was actually a big supporter of getting the Red Pill movie shown down under. And for that, I give him full credit, despite the fact that I disagree with him about other things. But he wrote an article about, well, what I'm doing this video on. The fact that Huffington Post posted an article which was fake, and they got suckered and didn't check the facts, and basically are supporting this bullshit article. Now, just in case you think that some of the statements I've said in this video are, exaggerations or anything like that, where I've said that the fake article, the Poe article, is very much in line with actual beliefs of the intersectionality crowd. Just in case you think that that's not accurate, here are some comments from the person responsible for posting the article on Huffington Post courtesy of Andrew Bolt's article. I think it's a good way to end this video.
Yet editor-in-chief of HuffPoe SA, Varashni Pillai, defended the post. Garland's underlying analysis about the uneven distribution of wealth and power in the world is pretty standard for feminist theory. In that sense, there was nothing in the article that should have shocked or surprised anyone, or so we thought. Dismantling the patriarchal systems that have brought us to where we are today, a world where power is wielded to dangerous and destructive ends by men, and in particular white men, necessarily means a loss of power to those who hold it. Those who have held undue power granted to them by the patriarchy must lose it for us to be truly equal. This seems blindingly obvious to us all.
So, going through this article reminded me of a conversation I had about 9 or 10 years ago. I used to be a teacher, and I had a student who I will call M, who was, I think, mid to late 20s. I think he's like 27, maybe 28, something like that. I can't remember, to be honest. It was a long time ago. M was an interesting character. I think he was a pickup artist, thinking back, because he used to go on about these DVDs on some fucking dating tip thing or something. I don't know. I don't know who he was talking about. I'd never heard the term pickup artist at the time. And he wasn't very well liked in the class. He would routinely come out with comments like, women are less intelligent than men, or something like that. And considering that the majority of the class at the time was female, they fucking hated him. He wasn't obviously learning any dating tips from those DVDs, because there weren't any women talking to him. They want nothing to do with him. And to be honest, I don't really blame them. He was also a bit strange when it came to capitalism and communism. It was like sometimes he would be one and other times he would be the other. It was a bit confusing, or maybe I should say he was a bit confused. He was born in South America, and his family had come here when he was still very young, and he'd often talk about earning enough money to go back to his country of birth and living like a king. So when he was in that mode, he really didn't care about the poor, didn't give a shit about them. He wanted to be wealthy and to have power, etc., etc. But then other times he would be the exact opposite of that. It was strange. So one of those times is the basis of this story. One day he comes out with this comment that there is enough money in the world for everyone to be a millionaire. Well, to be fair, I can't remember if he said money or wealth or assets. So I'm going to be generous and just go with wealth in general, not just cash, but assets and the whole thing. And what he meant by everyone being a millionaire was that $1 million would still hold the same value that it does now if we gave everyone $1 million. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through this argument step by step and debunk it, because it's a really, really fucking stupid argument. But I'm going to be very, very generous to M as I go through it. I'm going to be as generous as I possibly can to him, step by step. So let's start with the math, first of all. Until I started doing this video, I'd never actually looked at the figures to see if his claim was correct, but it always sounded like bullshit to me. It just didn't seem correct that there would be 1 million times more wealth in the world than people. So just before recording this, I did a search on the internet and I found the Global Wealth Report, and according to that, there is $256 trillion in the world, and there are 7 billion people in the world. So, provided these figures are correct, and provided I've done the math correctly, if we divided the world's wealth amongst everyone, each person would get $36,571.80 and some loose change, which, isn't that far off $1 million each if you really are shit at math, that is. For those people who can count, it's a long way away. So, right off the bat, M has fucked up with the math. Don't know where he heard this from. He might have just made it up. I really don't know. But, like I said, I'm going to be generous to him. And I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, let's say his claim is correct. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there is enough wealth in the world that we could divide it up and everyone gets $1 million. So everyone is equal, right? It would still be a disaster. There's a little thing called inflation. So just because someone has $1 million in the bank doesn't mean that it's going to be worth what $1 million today is worth. For example, I think it was back in 2010, I bought a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note off eBay for, I think it was less than $5. So, yeah, if we divided the world's wealth up amongst everyone and everyone had $1 million in the bank, the $1 million would not be worth what $1 million now is worth. You would find that buying a carton of milk would cost you, I don't know, $10,000 or something like that, right? The currency would be devalued. But, like I said, I'm going to be very generous to M. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that everyone goes to sleep one night, they wake up the next morning, and everyone has exactly $1 million in the bank, and it is still worth what $1 million was the day before, right? So it hasn't lost any value. Everyone is exactly equal, and everyone is a millionaire. It still wouldn't work. Society would grind to a stop. Now, there are plenty of people out there who are millionaires who continue to work. Probably the best example is famous actors who could get, $10 million or something for a movie, but they don't then quit. They go on to make more movies. It's the same with famous musicians, and as well as a lot of businessmen. They make millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, and they still work because they enjoy the work. But not everyone is in this position. Most people who do work out of necessity, you give them $1 million and they wouldn't turn up to work anymore. I remember hearing a story of someone who was working in a factory and he won the lottery, and he said he was still going to go to work every day because he enjoyed it. But that's not your average person in that situation. There are plenty of millionaire actors who continue to act. I don't think there are many people who are waiting tables who become millionaires and then continue waiting tables because, they find it an artistic expression or a challenge or something. So a very large percentage of the workforce would just stop turning up to work. They would go on holiday around the world, or go fishing, or write the book they've always wanted to write, or fill the spa bar full of caviar and drink beer all day. I mean, why wouldn't you, right? So I guess one way we could get around this is business owners could offer to pay people more money, right? So instead of paying someone to be a waiter or a waitress in your restaurant, paying them minimum wage, instead of that, maybe you could pay them $10,000 an hour or something, right? Because maybe that would motivate them to come into work. But then that's going to mean that the food is going to cost more, which means people are going to have to pay more for food, which means we're back to that inflation problem. So even if we start with no inflation on day one, it would quickly result in inflation and the $1 million being devalued. Or society would just grind to a halt altogether, because not enough people would be turning up to work. Now, M had a solution for this. He said people would turn up to work because they'd get bored. That's true of some people, but I think there would be a lot of people sleeping in, going fishing, going on trips around the world, drinking beer, writing that book they've always wanted to write, doing more interesting things than shitty jobs that pay you a shitty wage and don't really appreciate you. But like I said, I'm going to be really generous to M. So let's say he is correct. Let's say everyone who does shitty low-paid work out of necessity for some unknown reason get bored and still turn up to work collecting their minimum wage, even though they don't need it, and therefore society doesn't grind to a halt or we don't have massive inflation. I know it's crazy, but let's just go with it for the sake of argument. It still wouldn't work. And the reason why is because everyone is different. Some people would make really wise choices with their money. They would invest it very wisely. Some people might start their own business and be very successful. Others might invent something. Maybe, they invent a new microprocessor or something. Who knows? And their money will multiply. So over a period of time, they won't have $1 million in the bank anymore. They might have 10 million or 100 million or 2 million. But it's more than what they started with. And at the same time, there are going to be people who waste their money. Maybe they go on an around-the-world trip, flying first class everywhere, staying in the most expensive hotels and eating the most expensive meals, doing absolutely nothing on the cheap. Your money's eventually going to run out. Maybe they go to the casino every day. Maybe they throw lavish parties. Once again, I remember hearing a story of a family that won the lotto and they blew all the money in a year. They were just irresponsible and just blew the lot. Some people are like that. So over time, you'd get people which have vastly less money than $1 million. They might have $50,000. They could have $100. They could be flat broke. So the question is, what do we do at that point? Do we then take the money from those who have been responsible and wise with their money and give it to those who have been irresponsible or unlucky or wasteful? Or do we just let it go? And if we let it go, then once again this becomes a generational problem where those who are poor are going to have children who grow up poor, and those who are rich are going to have children who grow up rich with all the advantages of that. So eventually we're going to be back to where we started. But at the same time, it doesn't seem fair to take money away from those who have been wise and responsible and giving it to those who have been wasteful. And it takes away the motivation to actually be responsible and make wise investments with your money. Why not just blow it if you're going to get it back? I remember years ago, I used to play Texas Hold'em with a couple of friends. It was just a casual game, nothing too serious. And when we started, we would just play for the chips, right? No actual money. And what we found is that people would just go all in, even if they had a shit hand. Because what would happen if they lost all their chips? We would just divvy up the chips again and give them back to them because we wanted to play the game. We wanted to continue the game. But it wasn't the same because the chips had no real value. So what we started doing is playing for... It was something small like $5. And that was enough to change people's attitudes. And if they did go all in and lost all their chips, they'd have to buy back in for a couple of bucks. No big deal. It wasn't something that was going to send anyone broke. But the fact that it was real money, which was going to cost them even a couple of dollars, meant that their attitude was different. And if someone knew that they could blow $1 million and then just, get it back, then what exactly would be their motivation for being responsible? Why wouldn't they just fucking blow it? Why wouldn't you go on a trip around the world endlessly, right? Until you blow the lot and then just get the money back again, right? We just take all the money from those who have been responsible and give it to those who have been unlucky or irresponsible. So everyone's even again. Yeah, it just wouldn't work. And I somehow get the feeling that M's fantasy about going back to South America and living like a king is still just a fantasy.